Before we begin, a quick note. The audio quality on my side of this conversation is not as clear as usual. Technology was not our friend on the day of recording. However, the discussion itself was too important and valuable not to share with you. So thank you for your patience in listening past the little imperfections.
Memorials in general, they're not necessarily defined by a moment in time. They're defining something that has happened in the past. We just need more of these spaces that people can come and be. Those who've survived domestic violence, there is a huge amount of resilience that these people are carrying with them. Some of the largest barriers that we've got in front of us is the fact that people don't talk about this. This isn't something that we can ignore. People are shrouded in shame and continue to live in terrible circumstances because of the embarrassment and the shame of what they're enduring.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Muir's director Amy Muir holds degrees in both interior design and architecture from RMIT University, ensuring that the practice places equal value on the holistic crafting of interior and external form as one. Established in 2016, the practice engages with a range of projects including residential, public and institutional briefs, bringing a sympathetic and strategic attitude to the varying contexts that they work within. The practice is underpinned by a firm belief in project-based research that investigates the language of memory and place. Muir has been recognised through state, national and international awards, and the work has been widely published locally and internationally. As past Victorian President of the Australian Institute of Architects and as a lecturer at RMIT University, Amy is committed to establishing strong links between teaching and research, architecture practice and public advocacy.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Amy.
No, thank you, Catherine.
Now, Amy, I had the beauty of listening to you speak at a Shrine of Remembrance talk that was part of the Open House program earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about how you got started in design and architecture.
I think there's always been a fascination in making and, was sort of surrounded by that growing up. My father was always sort of tinkering and enjoyed making things and building. He wasn't a builder, but it was certainly something that he enjoyed to do on the weekends. And so we're certainly surrounded by that. And I think architecture was always something that was sort of in the back of my mind, but also really enjoyed drawing and painting and fine art. And when I was in year 10, I think I went to an open day for RMIT, assuming I would go and look at the architecture course, and became very seduced by the interior design course at the time and ended up sort of channeling all my energy into studying interior design and did that. And also while I was studying interior design, I went on an exchange to the UK for a year and studied architecture, and then came back and completed my interior design and then went on to study architecture at RMIT, which was really just a sort of a way of, I suppose, formalising the training I'd had in interior design as well. And it was something that I was very keen to, I suppose, the qualification of architecture allowed me to do what I'd been trained to do in interior design. So it was a nice thing to be part of. And I think, for me, architecture, there's many aspects to it, but I've always been interested in, I think residential architecture is something that's, it's a really nice thing working with clients directly, but also public architecture, which really talks to how we can contribute to the public realm. And, this idea that space sort of becomes something that is for all, and it becomes something that inherently got a very generous role to play within society. And that's something that I'm really interested in contributing to as well.
From the work that I've seen you involved with, and we'll talk more about your involvement in the design of Victoria's Family Violence Memorial, but it seems like you have managed to incorporate a social conscience into your design practice?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think architects are essentially trained in that way. I think the degree or the training that we have is a very broad training, and it understands sort of the impact that architecture has historically and on our built environment, and that it's impacted from a historical point of view, it's impacted by politics, it's impacted by the way that society evolves. And so I think we're very much trained to sort of have that lens to see the world in a particular way. And it becomes, I think, this idea of advocacy and how we can talk to the world in a particular way. I think we feel, I'm talking collectively, but I think we all feel very passionate about how the world can evolve through architecture and to be a better place rather than one that's obviously suffering. And how we can do that, we're only architects, so we have a limited capacity to be able to do that. But I think there is definitely a social conscience that we carry in our role as architects.
And perhaps it's a good opportunity to introduce the background to the Family Violence Memorial. Because from my experience working, at Royal Botanic Garden, I certainly understand all the elements in relation to architecture from a landscape perspective. And it is quite fascinating just how much you have to take you know, into the brief when you're actually designing something. So can you talk us through the process about how that first came to your attention, and then and walk us through how it evolved during that period?
Mm. So Mark Jacques from Openwork and myself, our practices share a design studio in the city, and have and do collaborate on projects together. But this brief came to Mark as a landscape architect, but from my perspective, I'd sort of been doing a lot of research for many years on memorialisation, and Mark and I had sort of had many conversations around a shared passion for cemeteries and, that lovely in-between space between architecture and landscape, and how we sort of understand the evolution of the cemetery and how that's evolved over time.
That is a unique shared passion that you have with me.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. I think the role of memorialisation, once again, within society it's a very big thing, but it's often sort of put to the side. We often aren't necessarily focused on the cemetery as being a central part of our city making. And so I think, yeah, and so I think that was definitely a shared conversation. And there's a project in just outside of Barcelona in Spain, Igualada Cemetery by Enrique Morales and Carme Pinos, that I've always been very passionate about for many, many years. And when Mark and I first met, that was one of the projects that we sort of talked about. So yes, shared passion, shared conversations. We also, I think, our love of architecture and landscape is mutual, and we don't actually see the boundary between the two. The conversations are, it's very fluid. So sort of talking about disciplines isn't really what we talk about. When we collaborate, it's a collaboration across both disciplines, and it just becomes very sort of soup-like. So yeah, so that project came to Mark, and we decided to submit the tender as a collaboration. And we rewarded the tender, which was fantastic, working with the City of Melbourne and also with the Office for Women within the Victorian Government as well. And so I think for us, what was great about that project is that it came with a really strong brief from the City of Melbourne. They had done a fair amount of consultation already prior to us coming to the project over a number of years. A lot of consultation had already occurred with the Office of Women through understanding, what would be required or what would be desired through a memorial, and to effectively talk about the issue of family violence. So we were in a really good position, I suppose, from the very beginning of the project, having that to rely upon as a body of work, which is really very important when you start a project is that the brief is a really good sound brief from the client. So that was a wonderful starting point. And we also, on our team, we brought in Sarah Lynn Rees, who works at Jackson Clements Burrows Architects. And she is an Indigenous advisor. She's a Palawa woman. And she was also on the team. So the three of us were working very closely together. And that allowed us to obviously have cross conversations around obviously the significance of this site. And also Sarah led us through, along with the City of Melbourne, through the conversations with the Wurundjeri, Bunurong and Bunurong people. So that was fundamental to the way that the memorial came about as well, because that consultation hadn't happened prior to us coming onto the project. And so that was a very important part of what we felt needed to be brought to the project. City of Melbourne, obviously, were leading that, and that was an important aspect to how they saw that the memorial needed to be addressed as well. But yeah.
And can you talk through some of the sensitivities that you had to take into consideration when you were dealing with family violence? What were some of the learnings that you were taking from that briefing that you were getting and noticing that you really had to be, very conscious of moving forward in design?
Yeah. So one of the very, very important and very special moves that the Office for Women and City of Melbourne made in the briefing process was that they had established, Office of Women had established a group of Victim Survivors Advisory Council. And that council, the day that we presented and for the first time and had a meeting for schematic design, they were in the room. Representatives from that council were in the room. Those representatives were in every meeting right up till the day that we handed the project over at the end of construction. And not only did we establish a really strong working relationship with them, we established a friendship with them, and their guidance was completely, it was invaluable in terms of the design process and the conversations that we were having directly with them and understanding. And it was such a ginormous learning curve for us all to be taken on, and their grace and generosity was quite extraordinary in terms of leading us through that process. So that was absolutely fundamental to the success of the project, and will remain so forever. That was a very important part and a very important move from the Office for Women understanding the significance of their role and to play. And I would suggest that, when we talk about stakeholder engagement, this is what we want it to look like. This is what it should be like, moving through a project together, and so that there are many voices at the table.
And what were some of the things that the women who were sharing their lived experience, what did you learn from what the stories they had to tell?
Yeah, well, there were women and men who had stories to share. And I think probably the biggest learning for us was that these stories have a familiar base, but they are different. And everyone has a different story to tell. And they're drawn together by a commonality, but there's variances in these narratives, which they're all having to carry and support each other. But it's a very, very large burden a lot of them are carrying. And I think also this acknowledgement that this is a societal issue, that this isn't an individual issue. This isn't something that we can ignore. It needs to be talked about every day. It needs to be discussed openly and frankly. Perpetrators need to be supported, and that, like, every part of society is impacted by this. This isn't just one sector of the society that is dealing with this. This is a very, very broad issue, and it's very ingrained in our society, unfortunately. And it's something that we consciously have to address in order to make improvements and in order to make change. And I think the other thing was that Mark and I came to the project thinking that we could talk about statistics and that would be a way to talk about the project and to highlight the complexity of the project. And we were told very quickly that there are no firm statistics associated with family violence, that it's an immeasurable condition that is unable to be measured at the moment. And that's a very sort of shocking reality when talking about an issue, because I think memorials in general, they're not necessarily defined by a moment in time. They're defining something that has happened in the past, generally speaking. And so it's very easy to talk about statistics when we talk about memorials in general, but to be in a position where, and we sort of refer to this memorial as a memorial in motion, that it is something that unfortunately is not witnessing an end point to something, but it's acknowledging the existence of a very big issue.
And that must be tremendously difficult. So then how do you design when it's something that's constantly evolving, a constant topic within the media and reports that come out? We see on a weekly basis more people affected by family violence every week. And how do you design a memorial when, as you were saying, when we think of memorials, it's something that happened in the past. This is something that happens every day.
So I think, I mean, we, initially we really were drawing upon the context of the site and understanding that, and also drawing upon our research into memorials and the idea of memorialisation, how people need to be in spaces. And so this idea that if we look at the Shrine of Remembrance, for instance, it needs to cater sometimes for maybe 10 people, sometimes 15,000 people, sometimes 100,000 people. It varies. And so the idea that memorials have to sort of accommodate a flux, something that is in flux, is an important thing to consider. And I think the opportunity of this site that we saw was that it's on a corner site in East Melbourne and sits adjacent to the Treasury building and adjacent to the Commonwealth building. And that the triangular site and being that sits directly opposite to Fitzroy Gardens meant that there was a relationship to a landscape beyond. So the relationship to landscape is very important, and we know that as a thing that is inherent in people's ability to heal as well, and that is becoming, obviously we know that, but the research is telling us that as well, that it is fundamental to the way that we design hospitals. It's fundamental to the way that we think about people being able to connect with landscape, and that becomes a really important aspect to how we think about memorialisation. And so for us, there were a number of things that we were having to respond to. One of them as well was that there was an existing memorial on the site. When we first came to it, there was a few significant trees and a park bench and a memorial that was observing the forced adoption practices. And we found that memorial had been located near the elm tree that exists on the site, the existing elm tree. And that memorial had its back facing the Commonwealth building. And that sort of this idea that this Commonwealth building symbolised for so many people, this land was very contentious for Indigenous people. Its adjacencies to Treasury was a problem, in the conversations that we had with the Indigenous groups, was that there will be people who will struggle to come to this site because of its adjacencies. So we were very sort of cognizant of, I suppose, the context initially, and how we would respond to the context. And also the lie of the land. There's a 4-metre drop across that site. And we also needed to make this very accessible for people in wheelchairs, children in prams. The idea is that this space is for everyone to come to. It's for families, it's for perpetrators, it's for people who are there who know people who have died as a result of it. It's for people who are currently suffering as a result of domestic violence. So its accessibility had to be one that was very gentle and inviting. And so there are a number of moves that we made that allowed for this space to effectively have a room. We refer to it as a room, but it's an outdoor room. And this room is what we refer to as a congregation space, but it's almost a horseshoe of a space that faces back towards the gardens. And that was very deliberate, because this idea that you're always facing the Fitzroy Gardens, and that became this idea that when we're connecting with landscape, there's the immediate landscape that we have, and then there's the landscape beyond. And this idea that the gaze beyond is a very important one. And the positioning of the memorial, as in the congregation space, meant that people could stand up on the raised landscape and look down into that space, but could also then get a long view across and down into the Fitzroy Gardens. And so this idea of the gaze and the view beyond, we wanted to make that a very accessible aspect of this memorial. And because of the lie of the land, we were then able to embed the landscape. And so we talked a lot about this idea of the purple landscape, and that purple being, the colour and the signifier of domestic violence. And we saw this as a political gesture, one that, throughout the year, this garden would always be in flower. And Liz Herbert from Openwork curated that beautifully in terms of the seasonality of the flowering plants. And so it's always in flower at some point.
Yeah, the choice of the plantings to complement the design is really beautiful and really striking also in the colour palette that's chosen of the hard landscaping as well. Very, very beautiful.
And I think so you'll see the figure of the landscape is essentially to hug the wall of the memorial. And so this idea that you're cocooned within the landscape, and the steel plate wall, which quite delicately, but as a material is very robust. And so it was this idea of, a balancing act between fragility and strength, and this understanding that those who are dealing with domestic violence, those who've survived domestic violence, there is a huge amount of resilience that these people are carrying with them, and that is not to be denied. And so the steel wall effectively is the memorial. It defines the memorial, and it becomes the figure in the landscape, and then the landscape essentially cocoons the site. And you'll also see, because of the lie of the land shifting, by 4 metres, we struck a datum. And so when you're in the memorial, the wall height is at about 800 mil. And so that was, for us, that we defined that as being a very comfortable height for people to sit within, for people to stand within, for children to be able to access the space. And safety is a really imperative thing for this memorial as well, feeling safe, feeling like you can see in all directions. So that was important as well. And so this wall at 800 mil then slides out of the landscape, and it changes height as you move through the lie of the land, but it's actually the same datum for the entire site. And so that was very strategic, just from a comfort perspective and how people could sit and be within the space.
It must have been challenging, as you said, that it's got to be from a functionality purpose. It has to accommodate, one person that goes there as solitary reflection to very large gatherings. So to design in that respect is quite, I'm sure, would have posed quite the challenge. But can we talk about the consultation that Sarah led with the traditional owners of the area and through that process? Because a lot of people may be very unfamiliar with what that involves and also what the conversations would be about.
Yeah, once again, very, very generous conversations. And the learning curve was enormous. So, I mean, Sarah and Sky from the City of Melbourne, did a beautiful job of curating those conversations and guiding them. But I think because of the three language groups at that time, they all brought an understanding of what landscape obviously entailed and meant. And so there were many, many stories that we were told about the significance of landscape from an Indigenous perspective. The thing that was emphasised was this sense that once again, it's a societal issue. This isn't an issue that's isolated to a particular sector of the community. It is everywhere. And I think also what came out of that was this desire for, in saying that, how do we actually ensure that people understand that this is a shared issue and that this is shared across every sector of our society? How do we actually ensure that that's communicated in some way? And so we were very, very keen to find sort of a way of talking about that. And in one of the conversations, one of the lines that came up was, the law of the land is to keep people safe. And for us, that really resonated with the idea that the land that we sit on and within is fundamental to understanding how us as people living on Indigenous land can think about the generosity of those gestures. And that was incredibly powerful. And it was a statement that we then took back to the working group, so the Victim Survivors Advisory Council, and suggested to them that that became a way of, it became basically the way of talking across the project to everyone through that statement. And so that became the statement for the memorial. One of the other things was also the embedding of ceremony within the design. And so we designed a smoking vessel that's permanently engaged and sits within the design and is embedded within what we refer to as the memorial wall. And the memorial wall, as you come down the ramp or the space into the seating area, there's a pleated steel wall. And that's been designed around sort of a smudging of, we sort of refer to this idea of a collaging and a smudging of the architecture that sits adjacent to the site. But it also, we were very cognizant when we were talking about the lack of statistics and this idea of the immeasurable, we were also sort of very cognizant that there is no way of really grappling or understanding how we contain this thing or how we define this issue. And so the wall recedes under the land, and in one way, and it's black, so it's difficult to see the end point of the recesses and the perspective that sort of generates. But it effectively becomes a way of, receding into the land, not being able to perceive the depth of that gesture, but also it has an enormous amount of strength because it's holding the land above. And that land is what holds the people who come to visit the memorial. And so Sarah sort of talked about, we were talking about what is the size of a smoking vessel. And she said, imagine it's the size of cradling a baby. And so the smoking vessel, the geometry was born out of the geometry of the wall, but it was also the scale of, this gesture of, cradling a baby. And as you walk down the ramp, the idea is that it sits directly adjacent to the grassed area. And so the elders that are carrying out the smoking ceremony can stand with their feet on the ground, and those that walk through the memorial can walk through the smoke, which is an important part of the welcoming ceremony to the site.
And having a look at the images at the moment, Amy, I'm imagining that if there is a crowd that is gathered in that space for smoking, especially with the circular horseshoe that you were referring to, that sort of gives you a big hug, and then you have the perspective of where they would be standing for the smoking ceremony with that sort of cradle that you were referring to, where they would have that. That would be very beautiful, because it would be, as you're seated, the smoke would actually kind of come across you at sort of like your head height. So your whole body would be beautifully cleansed by the smoke. So just the simple detail in that, in the design, is amazing.
Mm. Well, I think, I mean, and this is, once again, this is the wonderful thing that is born out of collaboration, is that these conversations are cross conversations. And prior to starting construction on site, we had a smoking ceremony on site, which was very, very special. And there was a small group of us who attended that. And the ashes that were taken were basically retained from that smoking ceremony and were given to the manufacturers of the concrete pavers, and the ashes were put into those pavers. So the ashes from that initial welcoming and cleansing of the site are now embedded back into the memorial. And that for us was sort of a really important gesture as well. And the other thing as well was the decision around the message, and I haven't got the message, the text on the memorial plaque. I haven't got it here with me, but that went through, a very, very involved process with the victim survivors, which was very humbling to be part of, because it's a very moving statement that is made. But what was said in that was that, as we acknowledge, the law of the land is to keep people safe. So that was the first thing that was written, and it was written in Wurundjeri. And we thought that that was very important. And then on the smoking vessel, the same statement is written, but it's only written in Wurundjeri. So we sort of have this anticipation that children might want to know what is written there, and that they would do a rubbing on the smoking vessel, and that they would need to investigate what that meant. And so for us, it wasn't, it's not just about clarifying, it's also people investigating is part of this. Which brings me to talk about one of the most important things that was communicated by the victim survivors is this role of education, and talking about it as a role of education. And that is fundamental to, as we were saying before, we need to be talking about this every single day. But if we can educate our children to understand what this is, rather than shrouding them from it and not talking about it, but actually openly discussing it, then that will assist with the way that we start to break down some of these barriers. Because some of the largest barriers that we've got in front of us is the fact that people don't talk about this, that people are shrouded in shame and embarrassment and don't come forward and continue to live in terrible circumstances because of the embarrassment and the shame of what they're enduring. And so if we can talk about it more and acknowledge that it isn't shameful, it's a product of a situation that they're in, I think that that would be a very important thing.
And what's interesting, when you were talking earlier on, Amy, you corrected me in saying it was women and men that were part of the advisory council of the victim and survivors who spoke to you and shared their lived experience in this process. And the fact that it's actually been named a family violence memorial, and just even your reference there in relation to children being able to do the etchings with the language. So it really has been very conscious, even in the design elements, to sort of challenge those sort of biases we have, that it's a women only, that's the conversation. So I really like how by design itself, it is actually challenging what some of our biases are in society.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, that was loud and clear in all the conversations that we had with the victim survivors. That was very evident, and it was something that we were carrying, I suppose, with us, that we had to be very cognizant of.
And tell me, what were some of the hardest sort of ethical challenges that you had when you were going through this process? Because, you're dealing with the sensitivities of people with lived experience, you're dealing with traditional owners with their own sensitivities and connected to the country. So I'm sure there was quite a few you had to negotiate.
Yeah, to be honest, I think it was acknowledging that what we were sort of tasked to do was a tricky thing, to be able to address everyone's concerns and everyone's grief. And I think one of the hardest things that happened was through the acknowledgement that there are no statistics and that we don't know everyone's names who have died as a result of family violence. We're not able to put anyone's names or acknowledge any individuals within this memorial because it is an unknown condition. And so if we were to add some people's names to it, then it would be excluding those who hadn't had the strength to come forward. And no one wanted to be in the position where we were excluding anyone. And so that, for some, was probably a tricky thing to acknowledge, because we wanted this to be a place where people could come and remember those who had passed. And I think there's this thing where, similar to a cemetery, where, we understand that the people who are buried at a cemetery haven't necessarily died at that place. But there is a thing with family violence that sometimes it doesn't happen in the home. It happens in other places, and that acknowledgement of someone's place of death is an important thing for those who are dealing with the grief. So once again, there's a multitude of ways that people have experienced this condition. And so that is such a complex thing to be able to try and cater for, because it's so nuanced and it's quite overwhelming. Like, if you think about the grief that so many people are carrying, it's a really, really tricky thing. And I think that would probably have been the hardest thing to manage, was really how could we appease everyone? And we knew that very quickly that we weren't ever going to be able to do that. And so it was really about, well, how can we try and cater for society largely? And in not acknowledging people's names, for us, made it even more poignant how difficult this subject is. If we can't name everyone, that's really, really hard and tricky.
Tell me, Amy, what were your learnings through the project about domestic violence?
I think that domestic violence now, which is a very positive thing, is now being recognised in multiple ways. It's not, I think, coercive control now is obviously becoming very apparent in society, and that is recognised now as obviously a form of family violence, and that in itself has a whole lot of complications associated with it. And I think the thing with family violence is that it can be a very lonely and quiet thing. And we may not necessarily be aware of what anyone's experiencing in their personal life, despite what they're carrying with them. And so I think it's being more cognizant of how complex people's lives are, and that we need to step gently around those who we know and particularly those who we don't know. There was an interesting article the other day. Women's Agenda were talking about a recent police blitz that they've done in New South Wales over sort of a week and a half ago. And one of the statistics that really stood out to me was that they are currently receiving every 3 minutes a report for domestic violence. And this is a very shocking statistic, given that we know so many people don't report domestic violence. And that is only in New South Wales at the moment. That is currently what is happening in one state in this country. And that is an extraordinary demand for support of this issue. And there is a lot of silence around that 3 minutes is what I would suggest.
And a clear indication that it's a classic iceberg situation where you're only seeing the tiny tip of it at the top, not what's actually really the main issue, which is not what's reported, and things that we can't see and we're not speaking about below the water.
Yeah. No, and I just think, I mean, it's great that Women's Agenda is really highlighting these issues, but we just need to be talking about this more and more, and yeah, assisting in every way we possibly can, because I think the other thing to acknowledge as well is that grief manifests in so many different ways for people. Certainly there is no rule book for grief. You know, there's, from a psychological point of view, they've got the various steps and stages mapped out, but it doesn't apply like that. It doesn't roll itself out like a book, is probably what I'm trying to say. And so people's grief that they're carrying can be very, very complex. And that's a hard thing for us to sort of all collectively acknowledge. But I think if we can be more compassionate, and in government acknowledging these issues is a very, very significant step forward. And so if I think about this site now, when we came to it, it was such a contentious site. But now I look at it and I see that this government building is actually now, it is the custodian of this memorial. It is responsible moving forward for taking responsibility for how society addresses this issue. And so in a way, this conclusion with this site, and it's not a conclusion by any means, but I think there is something, that dynamic now that's been set up on that site between honouring and acknowledging family violence, as well as, the forced adoption practices and the complexity associated with that. I think that it's taken a nice little turn in a way.
And learnings around hearing you speak, Amy, certainly make us realise that the challenges around family violence is the fact that we will never know the true statistics because it is not a subject that's talked about openly. People don't report their incidents of family violence. So you just talking through those learnings really gives us a real clear picture of the reasons why we will never know true names associated with family violence in Australia. Something that I like when you were talking through the design and the sight lines and the fact that when you're sitting in the memorial, you look out to a garden. You're not actually looking to a centre point that you've focused in the gardens, but it's actually more outwards. Can you talk us through about that decision process?
I think looking out and beyond is a very positive thing. So the other thing as well, that, you know, this idea that this landscape is purple and ever evolving and shifting and changing. We talked a lot to the victim survivors about the significance of the elm tree. And this was also for the forced adoption practices, viewing that elm tree was very important for them as well. And that elm tree essentially signifies a seasonal shift and change. And the idea that landscape is ever evolving and ever changing, and yet it talks to the passage of time. And this idea that although we can acknowledge and talk about the complexity of grief, grief is also governed by time to a large extent. And that this idea that as we move through life, things can become softer and gentler with time. And so the tree and the seasonality that comes with that tree is a very important aspect of the site, and the fact that during summer it provides shade and in winter it provides light. So I think that for us only gets amplified even more by the view beyond to the Fitzroy Gardens, and that is sort of the acknowledgement of landscape for us is very, very important. And, this idea of the gaze, not necessarily having to focus on what is right in front of you, I think is an important thing when we think about, if I think about attending ceremonies, we don't necessarily just focus on the speaker, but we actually look beyond, and looking beyond can provide us with comfort, and our gaze might pick up on things that provide us with comfort. And so our hope is that allowed for a near view and a very far view within that space.
That's really lovely. And tell me, given you have obviously specialised and researched a lot in memorials and the role of memorialisation in cemeteries, what do you see now with sort of the shift you're seeing in memorialisation and architecture and design? Where do you see the future moving now?
Well, I think the wonderful thing is to see that governments are acknowledging the role of memorials as being not necessarily acknowledging lines in the sand, but actually seeing them used to advocate for change. And that is starting to become a more and more apparent model for memorialisation, which is fantastic. And we just need more of them. We just need more of these, these spaces that people can come and be, and to sit and, and even if they aren't necessarily there for the particular cause, they're there because it's a space that they feel comfortable in. That is great, because then they will understand, hopefully, that they will leave with other memories that they will carry with them that are associated with a learning, and that's what we would hope would occur with memorials. So I think this thing of being able to occupy space, sit within spaces, is very important for memorials, and that they're no longer, we still have figures, and we still sort of, acknowledge and celebrate, a very traditional way of designing memorials through, statues and figures, but I don't want to diminish their role within the city, but I would suggest that the type of memorial that is now being considered to have a bigger political voice is a very important one, and we need to keep encouraging that and supporting that, because the evolution of them is providing support to others.
Maybe you've seen a shift in memorialisation move from perhaps acknowledging or honouring the single figure to more a collective experience?
Memorials have, they've done both traditionally. They've, in the collective, but typically we understand those memorials through wars. So, the acknowledgement of wars, or the acknowledgement of death through, the CFA memorial that's just adjacent down in the gardens opposite Treasury as well, which is a really beautiful space. But they become really important. Yeah, they signpost issues. And I think that they're far more relevant than, just acknowledging moments in time. I think these memorials carry a much larger role than probably what they were once anticipated to do, which I think is important. I think, if we, having said that, sorry, I'm really I'm not articulating what I'm saying particularly well, but I suppose what I'm trying to say, if we think about the role of the war memorial, that was very much a political gesture as much as it was an acknowledgement of those who had fought and lost their lives in the war. And so that, as an evolution, has only occurred through those memorials existing in the first place. And so our acknowledgement now is that, these need to be spaces that are not just acknowledging death, they're acknowledging a societal issue, and one that we need to address. and one that we need to talk about, and one that we need to, not talk about, and one that we need to be educated about, because the role of the shrine is a form of education daily. And so it's an evolution, I would suggest, is where we're currently at.
Amy, I can't thank you enough for sharing that amazing story of how it really evolved over time with the evolution and consultation of that particular, Victoria's Family Violence Memorial. It's very insightful to the process, and we don't normally get this opportunity to really see just what is involved and what consultation looks like, and the design considerations that go into such an amazing place for people to commemorate or even just reflect.
Oh, thanks, Catherine. It's been lovely talking with you.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.